Sarah's hands were the first thing the cameraman noticed. Too calm, too steady, as if they had seen much more dangerous places. But when he asked, Sarah would just smile and say journalism is a tough job. What happened that day during the live broadcast would change everyone's perception of Sarah forever. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If stories of hidden expertise and life-changing revelations resonate with you, subscribe for more tales of extraordinary people hiding their remarkable past in plain sight. The morning mist hung low over downtown Istanbul as Sarah Demir walked through the revolving doors of Channel 7 News. At exactly 7:30 a.m., she had maintained this precise routine for 5 years, 2 months, and 14 days. The security guard, Mehmet, offered his usual nod without looking up from his morning newspaper. To him, like everyone else at the television station, Sarah was simply another journalist, quiet, competent, unremarkable. Sarah's desk was positioned in the corner of the newsroom, away from the bustling activity near the assignment board. She preferred it that way. As she settled into her chair and powered up her computer, her movements were economical and practiced. Everything about her radiated professional competence, yet she remained virtually invisible to her colleagues. The morning editorial meeting took place in the main conference room. News director Kemal Uzkan stood at the head of the table, reviewing the day's story assignments with his usual brisk efficiency. Sarah sat near the back, as always, listening intently, but contributing little to the discussions that shaped the day's news coverage. "We have several interviews scheduled for today," Kemal announced, scanning his tablet. "Sarah, you're handling the health ministry spokesperson about the new hospital initiatives. Studio interview at 2 p.m. Live broadcast." Sarah nodded once, making notes in her leather-bound notebook. It was a routine assignment, the kind she had handled dozens of times before. No one questioned why she consistently avoided international assignments or war correspondence, despite her obvious intelligence and linguistic abilities. Cameraman Yusuf had worked with Sarah on numerous occasions over the past 3 years. A veteran of 20 years in television news, he had an eye for details that others missed. As he set up equipment for Sarah's afternoon interview, he found himself studying her hands as she reviewed her notes. "Sarah," he said during a break in the setup, "may I ask you something?" She looked up from her research materials, meeting his gaze with calm, intelligent eyes. "Of course, Yusuf. What can I help you with?" "Your hands," he said, gesturing toward where she held her pen. "They're very steady, unusually steady. I've worked with correspondents who've covered war zones, and they all have this particular way of holding things, like they're always ready for sudden movement." A ghost of a smile crossed Sarah's face. "Journalism is a tough job, Yusuf. We all develop our own ways of staying focused." Something in her deflection intrigued him further. Most journalists would have elaborated shared war stories or described challenging assignments. Sarah's response was carefully minimal, as if she were deliberately avoiding deeper conversation about her background. "Have you ever covered conflict zones?" he pressed gently. "Here and there," she replied, returning her attention to her notes. "Different places, different times." Yusuf studied her for another moment. The way she avoided specifics, the practiced neutrality of her responses, the subtle tension in her shoulders when discussing her past, all suggested someone with experiences she preferred to keep private. Throughout the morning, Sarah moved through her routine with characteristic quiet efficiency. She researched her interview subject, prepared thoughtful questions, and reviewed background materials with the same methodical approach she brought to every assignment. Her colleagues barely noticed her presence, which was exactly how she preferred it. Dr. Mehmet Arslan, the health ministry spokesperson, arrived at the studio precisely at 2 p.m. A distinguished man in his early 60s with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he carried himself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to public speaking. This was his 14th television interview in the past month, promoting the government's new healthcare initiatives. The studio lights were bright and hot as Sarah and Dr. Arslan took their positions at the interview desk. Yusuf made final adjustments to his camera angles, still thinking about his earlier conversation with Sarah. Something about her demeanor, the way she prepared for interviews, reminded him of correspondents he had worked with in places like Syria and Afghanistan, journalists who had learned to stay calm under pressure. "Good afternoon, and welcome to Channel 7 News," Sarah began as the red recording light illuminated. "I'm Sarah Demir, and today we're discussing the ministry's new hospital construction program with Dr. Mehmet Arslan." The interview progressed smoothly for the first 15 minutes. Dr. Arslan spoke enthusiastically about medical facility improvements, staff training programs, and equipment modernization. Sarah asked informed questions, demonstrating knowledge of healthcare policy that impressed both her guest and the production team. "Dr. Arslan," Sarah said, consulting her notes, "the ministry has allocated significant resources for emergency medicine training. Can you elaborate on the specific protocols being implemented?" "Certainly," Dr. Arslan replied, leaning forward in his chair. "We're focusing on trauma response, cardiac emergency procedures, and field stabilization techniques." That suddenly, mid-sentence, Dr. Arslan's face went pale. His left hand moved to his chest, gripping his shirt as his breathing became labored. His eyes widened with sudden fear and confusion. "Dr. Arslan," Sarah said, her voice remaining calm despite the obvious emergency developing live on television, "are you feeling all right?" Dr. Arslan tried to respond, but could only manage a weak gasp before slumping forward in his chair, his body going limp as consciousness faded. In the control room, panic erupted immediately. "Cut to commercial," shouted the director. "Get medical assistance now." But Sarah was already moving. Without hesitation, she stood from her chair and moved around the interview desk to where Dr. Arslan had collapsed. Her movements were fluid and purposeful, displaying none of the panic that had seized the rest of the studio crew. Yusuf continued filming, something telling him this moment was important. Through his viewfinder, he watched Sarah's transformation from quiet journalist to something entirely different. Sarah's hands moved to Dr. Arslan's neck, immediately checking for a pulse with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. Her fingers found the carotid artery, pressing gently while her other hand tilted his head back to open his airway. "Yusuf," she said without looking up, her voice carrying a new authority that none of them had heard before. "Call for an ambulance. Tell them we have a male, approximately 65 years old, experiencing what appears to be myocardial infarction. Possible cardiac arrest." The clinical precision of her language stopped everyone in the studio. This wasn't the terminology of a journalist describing a medical emergency. This was the assessment of someone with medical training. Sarah loosened Dr. Arslan's collar and checked his breathing. Finding his pulse weak and irregular, she positioned herself beside him and placed the heel of her palm on the center of his chest. "Sarah, what are you doing?" called the floor director, his voice tight with concern. "CPR," she replied simply, beginning chest compressions with perfect form and rhythm. Her movements were textbook perfect, 30 compressions followed by 2 rescue breaths, the cycle repeated with mechanical precision. As she worked, Sarah's entire demeanor had transformed. The quiet, unassuming journalist had disappeared, replaced by someone with the focused intensity of a medical professional. Her hands moved with absolute confidence, her breathing remained controlled, and her face showed the calm concentration of someone who had faced life-and-death situations many times before. 1, 2, 3, 4, she counted under her breath, maintaining the proper compression rate. "Come on, Dr. Arslan, stay with us." Yusuf continued filming, mesmerized by Sarah's transformation. Through years of covering medical emergencies, he had seen paramedics and doctors work, but Sarah's technique was flawless. More than that, she displayed the emotional control of someone who had performed emergency medicine under much more challenging circumstances. After 3 cycles of CPR, Dr. Arslan's breathing suddenly improved, and his eyes fluttered open. Color began returning to his face as his pulse strengthened. "Dr. Arslan," Sarah said, her voice gentle but firm, "you've had what appears to be a heart attack. Try to stay calm. Help is on the way." "What happened?" he whispered, clearly disoriented. "You collapsed during our interview. You're in the Channel 7 studio, and paramedics are coming. Just focus on breathing normally." Sarah continued monitoring his vital signs, her fingers never leaving his pulse point. She elevated his legs slightly using cushions from the studio furniture. Textbook treatment for shock and cardiac events. The paramedics arrived 12 minutes later, wheeling their equipment into the studio with practiced urgency. As they took over Dr. Arslan's care, the lead paramedic looked up at Sarah with professional curiosity. "Maman, did you perform the initial CPR?" "Yes," Sarah replied, stepping back to give them room to work. "Your technique is excellent. Are you medical personnel?" Sarah hesitated for just a moment. "I have some training." The paramedic nodded approvingly. "Well, whatever training you have, it probably saved his life. His rhythm is stabilizing, and his vitals are strong. Good work." As the paramedics prepared Dr. Arslan for transport to the hospital, the studio crew stood in stunned silence. Everyone had witnessed Sarah's transformation from quiet journalist to confident medical responder, and none of them knew quite how to process what they had seen. News director Kamal Özkan appeared at Sarah's elbow as the ambulance team wheeled Dr. Arslan out of the studio. "Sarah," he said quietly, "we need to talk." She nodded, knowing this conversation was inevitable. Of course, they relocated to Kamal's office, away from the curious stares and whispered conversations that had erupted in the newsroom. Once the door closed, Kamal turned to face her directly. "What I just witnessed, that wasn't basic first aid training. That was professional-level emergency medicine." Sarah remained silent, neither confirming nor denying his assessment. "Sarah, I've been in news for 25 years. I've worked with correspondents who've covered wars, natural disasters, every kind of emergency you can imagine. What you did out there, that level of competence comes from extensive training and experience. I'm grateful we were able to help Dr. Arslan," she replied carefully. Kamal leaned forward in his chair. "That's not an answer to my question. Where did you learn emergency medicine?" Sarah looked out the office window at the city beyond, considering how much truth she was willing to reveal. 5 years of carefully maintained anonymity hung in the balance. "I worked as a war correspondent before joining Channel 7, she said finally. "Where?" "Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, various conflict zones between 2010 and 20... Kamal's eyebrows rose. This was far more international experience than her personnel file indicated. "For which news organizations?" "Freelance mostly, Reuters, BBC, some Turkish outlets. I covered medical facilities, refugee camps, humanitarian crises, and the medical training." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "In war zones, journalists often work alongside medical personnel. You pick up skills when lives are at stake." "Sarah, what you demonstrated today wasn't picked up skills. That was trained, practiced emergency medicine." She met his gaze directly for the first time during their conversation. "During my time in Syria, I worked embedded with Doctors Without Borders. They were short-staffed, and I learned more than journalism during those assignments." "How much more?" "Enough to be useful when needed." Kamal studied her face, recognizing that she was still holding back significant information. "Sarah, why didn't you include any of this experience in your employment application?" "International war correspondence is exactly the kind of background we value." "Because I came here to get away from that work," she replied honestly. "I wanted assignments where the stakes weren't life and death every single day. But today you stepped back into that role without hesitation. Today someone needed help, and I was the only person available who could provide it." Over the following hour, Sarah gradually revealed more of her background. She had spent 8 years as a war correspondent, embedded with medical teams in some of the world's most dangerous conflict zones. She had learned emergency medicine out of necessity, working alongside doctors and nurses who were overwhelmed by the constant stream of casualties. "In Aleppo," she told Kamal, "there were days when I spent more time assisting in surgery than I did filing reports. The medical teams were so short-staffed that anyone with clean hands and steady nerves was pressed into service." "How much medical training did you actually receive?" "Enough to assist in trauma surgery, perform emergency stabilization, manage field hospitals when doctors were unavailable. I'm not a physician, but I learned to function as one when circumstances required it."
Kamal was quiet for several minutes, processing this information. Sarah, why didn't you continue in war correspondence? This kind of experience is invaluable. Her expression grew distant. Because after 8 years I had seen enough trauma to last several lifetimes. I came to Istanbul to find a quieter way to practice journalism, something that would let me help inform people without having to witness suffering every day. And today was different. Today someone collapsed in front of me, and I was the only person who could help. I couldn't just sit there and watch. Do you want to return to international assignment? No, she said firmly. What happened today was necessary, but it doesn't change what I want from my career now. I prefer the work I'm doing here. Word of the incident spread quickly through the television station. By the next morning, everyone knew that quiet Sarah Demir had saved Dr. Arslan's life using medical skills nobody knew she possessed. The footage Yusuf had captured showed her transformation from journalist to medical responder, and it had already begun circulating on social media. Dr. Arslan made a full recovery and was released from the hospital 3 days later. His first request was to meet with Sarah and thank her personally for her intervention. The doctors told me you performed textbook CPR, he said during their meeting. They said your response was what prevented serious brain damage or death. I'm just grateful you're feeling better, Sarah replied. Miss Demir, I have to ask, where did you learn such excellent emergency medicine? Sarah gave him the same abbreviated explanation she had provided to others: war correspondence, medical training acquired out of necessity, experience in field hospitals. Would you consider teaching these skills to others? Dr. Arslan asked. The ministry is always looking for qualified instructors for our emergency response training programs. Thank you, but my focus is on journalism. Of course. But if you ever change your mind, you would be a valuable addition to our medical training staff. Sarah returned to her regular duties, but the dynamic at Channel 7 had changed irrevocably. Her colleagues looked at her with new respect, and story assignments began reflecting recognition of her unique background and capabilities. News director Kamal called her into his office 1 week after the incident. Sarah, we've received several requests from other news organizations. They want to interview you about your background, your experience in war zones, your medical training. I'm not interested in being interviewed about my past, I understand, but I do want to discuss your future here at Channel 7. Sarah waited for him to continue. We're launching a new program focusing on international humanitarian crises, medical emergencies, refugee situations, disaster response. Your background makes you uniquely qualified to lead this coverage. I appreciate the offer, but I prefer my current assignments. Sarah, you have skills and experience that could help us tell important stories that other journalists can't cover effectively. Stories that could save lives by raising awareness. She considered his words carefully. What kind of stories? Medical infrastructure in developing countries, healthcare access in conflict zones, humanitarian crises that mainstream media often overlooks. I could do that kind of coverage without returning to active war zones. Absolutely. Studio interviews, documentary segments, analysis pieces, using your expertise to help viewers understand complex medical and humanitarian issues. Sarah was quiet for several minutes, weighing the proposal. I need time to think about it. Take all the time you need. The offer stands whenever you're ready. 2 weeks later, Sarah agreed to host a weekly segment called Medical Frontlines, in-depth coverage of healthcare issues, medical breakthroughs, and humanitarian medical work around the world. The program would draw on her unique combination of journalistic skills and medical knowledge without requiring her to return to the dangerous field work she had left behind. The first episode focused on emergency medicine training for civilians, inspired by Dr. Arslan's cardiac event and Sarah's response. She demonstrated basic CPR techniques, interviewed emergency medicine specialists, and discussed how ordinary people could potentially save lives in medical emergencies. Viewer response was overwhelming. Sarah's calm, authoritative presentation style, combined with her obvious expertise, made complex medical topics accessible and engaging. The program quickly became one of Channel 7's most popular segments. 3 months after the incident that changed everything, Sarah sat in her office preparing for another episode of Medical. Yusuf knocked on her door, camera equipment in hand for their afternoon taping session. "Ready for today's shoot?" he asked. "Always," she replied, then looked up at him with curiosity. "Yusuf, what made you notice my hands that first day?" He smiled. "I filmed in conflict zones. I recognize the way people move when they've learned to stay calm under pressure. Your hands never shake, never hesitate. That only comes from experience in places where hesitation can cost lives. You were very observant. Good cameramen notice details others miss. I'm glad I asked about it that day." "Why?" "Because it led to that interview where Dr. Arslan collapsed. If I hadn't been thinking about your background, I might not have kept filming when the emergency started. That footage helped people understand what they were witnessing." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes the most important moments happen when we're not planning for them." "Speaking of which," Yusuf said, "there's something I've been curious about since that day. You saved Dr. Arslan's life with your medical knowledge, but you've never really explained how extensive that training was." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then opened her desk drawer and removed a small wooden box. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a medal, the International Committee of the Red Cross Recognition Award for Medical Service in Conflict Zones. "I received this in 2017, she said quietly, "for service in field hospitals I spent 2 years working as both a journalist and a medical assistant, helping wherever I was needed most." Yusuf examined the medal with respect. "This is extraordinary, Sarah. Why don't more people know about this?" "Because I came to Istanbul to build a different kind of life. The work I did in Syria was necessary, but it took a toll. I wanted to find a way to help people without constantly confronting trauma and death. And now I've found a balance. I can use my experience to inform and educate people about medical issues without having to return to war zones. Medical Frontlines lets me help people in a different way." As they prepared for that day's filming, Sarah reflected on the unexpected path her life had taken. The quiet journalist identity she had constructed after leaving war correspondence had been shattered by a moment of crisis. But instead of forcing her back into the dangerous world she had left behind, it had led to something new, a way to use her unique combination of skills to serve both journalism and public health. 6 months later, Medical Frontlines had become one of Turkey's most respected health information programs. Sarah had found her calling in medical journalism, using her hard-earned expertise to help viewers understand everything from emergency response to global health challenges. The incident that had exposed her hidden background had ultimately led her to exactly where she needed to be, not hiding from her past, but integrating it into a new kind of future. Sometimes the most profound changes come not from the plans we make, but from the moments when life forces us to reveal who we really are. Dr. Arslan, fully recovered and back to his ministry duties, became a regular guest on Medical Frontlines. Their professional relationship had evolved into mutual respect and occasional collaboration on public health initiatives. "Sarah," he said, after taping one episode, "I've been thinking about that day when I collapsed during our interview. What about it? If you hadn't been there, if you hadn't had that medical training, I probably wouldn't have survived. But more than that, if you hadn't been willing to step forward and use skills you'd been keeping private, the outcome would have been very different." Sarah nodded. "Sometimes we have to choose between protecting our privacy and helping someone who needs us." "Do you ever regret giving up your anonymity?" She considered the question carefully. "I regret that the choice was forced on me by circumstances, but I don't regret the results. Medical Frontlines has allowed me to help people in ways I never expected. And your time as a war correspondent, that experience will always be part of who I am. I can't change what I saw or what I learned, but I can choose how to use those experiences going forward." Dr. Arslan smiled. "For what it's worth, I think you've made the right choice. The work you're doing now reaches thousands of people every week. You're probably saving more lives through education than you ever could through direct medical intervention. As Sarah walked home that evening through the streets of Istanbul, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this point. 5 years earlier, she had arrived in the city hoping to disappear into quiet anonymity, to leave behind the trauma and intensity of war correspondence. Instead, through an unexpected moment of crisis, she had discovered a new way to use her unique combination of skills. She was no longer hiding from her past, but she wasn't trapped by it either. She had found a path that honored both her experience and her desire for a more peaceful life. The hands that Yusuf had first noticed, hands steadied by years of working under pressure in the world's most dangerous places, now held microphones instead of medical instruments. But they still served the same fundamental purpose: helping people, saving lives, making a difference in the world. Sometimes the most important transformations happen not when we choose to change, but when circumstances force us to become who we were always meant to be.